I'm not going to hide the fact that I was homophobic when I was in the 70s because it was the culture. I'm not going to say I wasn't. I was. If you want to cancel me now, go ahead. I'm not trying to defend myself. I'm going to be honest about it.
Right.
That mindset hurt my brother. It hurt my brother David. It hurt my brother David. So I'm going to grow and I'm going to learn. I'm going to get better because I don't want to hurt my brother David. You know what I mean? I don't want to hurt people. I want to be better. And I think that's the attitude you have to take, which means you're going to look back and go, I probably screwed this up when I was younger and I did it wrong and I need to own that. And there's nothing wrong with that. Hey, welcome to Grown Up Boston with Mike Donahue and
David Donahue. Top of the morning to you.
David D. It's morning here where we are. When you're watching this, it might not be morning. Could be the evening. It could be the afternoon. We don't
Mike,
know.
it's my worlds, my rules. Keep going.
I'm not triggered by that. It's always your rules, you best. Okay. So David and I have been having some fun. This is our 7th episode. And listen, there's only like 25, 30 of you watching this. And thank you so much. I shouldn't say only because you are special. Thanks for watching this. And we're just having fun talking about subjects that are a little hard sometimes to talk about. And speaking of that, today we kind of wanted to dive in. We've always had this in mind that we were going to talk about this, but we, kind of reserving this for, kind of in the mood and what we think it might be appropriate time. But basically, David he's alluded to this a few times on the show here, that he is homosexual and I'm not. I'm straight. And we grew up in the same home, obviously. And with those dynamics playing out, not, and he's going to unpack this a little bit, but not abruptly because David didn't come out until he was 16 and I was already gone out of the house. But we kind of knew.
Which is a story of its own. But anyway, I digress.
That's another podcast. More
right,
11.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're going to just talk about this. So I've got some questions for Dave. Just, growing up in Weymouth, Massachusetts, a super heterosexual type town, kind of homophobic, blue collar, tough kids. I'm painting this with a broad brush. So if you're watching this and you're offended, I'm sorry. But overall, the vibe was very sexually charged. And so, growing up like that and then being gay had to have been tough. Let's just talk about that, first of all, Dave. Like just growing up in Weymouth, knowing that you were different. What was that like?
So it's in the context of a place in history, too. So it was the 70s, late 70s. I was supposed to graduate in 1983, and I didn't graduate. I dropped out of school as soon as I was legally able to. Well, I checked out a year or two before that, but I dropped out of school when I was 16. I went on to get a bachelor's degree, but part of the reason why I left Weymouth Public Schools is that I was getting to an age where my peers had expectations of me to start dating and being with women. And actually, there was almost like a little pool that went on with some of my friends, like when's Dave going to get laid kind of thing. And it was like it was like a peer push for me to start dating women. And most of all, like, most teenage boys, they looked at it like a conquest, right? So, and I just wasn't, it just wasn't my thing. And so I thought I'd better cut and run before, I get found out, because you got to keep in mind that right around the same time, there was a kid that was a couple of years older than me. His name was Gary, and he was brutally beaten up and sexually assaulted, actually, by a bunch of people that I knew. I mean, I didn't really hang out with them, but I hung out with some of their siblings, so it was very close to home. And they put that kid in the hospital. He was in the hospital for about a week. this kid was just, he was very effeminate, and they cornered him in the woods and brutalized him. And they all some of them went to prison for years over that. There were no hate crime laws on the books back then, but it was heinous enough that I think they charged him with kidnapping and sexual assault. They used a beer bottle on him. It must have been a brutal assault for that kid. So that was the atmosphere in which I lived. There was, I was, I guess, fortunate enough that I was able to, pass. But this kid was just, it was in his nature that he was just overly effeminate, and he was brutalized for it. So that's what that was like my template for,
like a backdrop, like the backdrop of your life,
right,
like
right, yep,
watching
having
that.
to, because that could have easily happened to me. And like I said, the people that went to prison, one of them was Michael, was your best friend early on, Mike. So,
Yeah.
it was just that's how close to home it was. These were not abstract fears; they were right at my back door, and right. So
Yeah, and that's why I brought up the whole that the atmosphere in Weymouth. Like, cause 6 months before that incident, I stopped hanging out with those guys, and not knowing that incident was going to happen, but that incident probably was going to happen because of the way those guys were, and
right.
the way I was becoming. But I ended up dating a girl that had a brain in her head, and it was just by the grace of God, basically, that I got out of that whole environment
Right, you
with
could have
them.
been among those guys, right?
I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing because they're not going to let me speak in schools if I have a felony on my record. I would have been right there with them that night. I mean, maybe not participating, but I would have been anybody that was there apparently got charged. So I would have been charged, and so I'm really grateful that I wasn't there.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, so that's your backdrop. You've got this. You understand what's happening, right? You're
Right.
going, okay. This is what's happening in my immediate society, my culture. That if you come out and you're effeminate, you say you're gay, there's a likelihood of getting really beat up bad. And I actually knew guys in school. There was another guy that I went to school with that I watched him get beat up by a bunch of people, primarily because he was a homosexual. And
Right. Right.
um, I was actually supposed to fight him, but it wasn't because of his sexual orientation. It was just I don't know what it was. It was a stupid thing between us. But what happened was before I even got there, he was already beat up because he had come out, or somebody knew he was gay, and they just ganged him. They just beat him up. They just beat the crap out of him. And so yeah, I mean, that was our backdrop. It was like, if you come out and you're homosexual, you're gonna pay a price, and so you knew
Right.
that.
Right. And I didn't. So when I was in school, I didn't really blend into the background. I was pretty popular, and that had its own struggles as well, because I had a lot to lose if people found out that I was gay. So it was hard keeping up. Just you and I have talked about this, trying to stay within the popular group, and then and then hiding that this secret, this lifestyle, this being gay is not really a lifestyle. I shouldn't use that word. Okay, so that kid in the woods, that he couldn't help but be who he was. So I'm sure maybe he tried to hide it. I don't know. But I became a great chameleon. I was able to, assimilate and, into that crowd, just barely. But as I said, as I got, into the, my later teens, I couldn't hide it anymore. People expected me to, be with women, and I had a bunch of women that had crushes on me. So it was weird. It was sort of like, I had this little slew of, girls that, were, that liked me. And I, I didn't know what to do about that. It
Yeah.
was,
I remember that. I
there was a lot
remember
of
you having
pressure.
all these hot girls around you all the time. I was like, I'm so jealous of you.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a difficult period in my life for sure. And, um, I mean, and with today's charged atmosphere, it's kind of weird because, I, I'm I'm not afraid of going, like, in this political climate. I'm not afraid of going back because I know how to live in that world. Do you know what I mean? So I'm not saying that that we're going to go back to the 70s, but I'm comfortable there, right? So I don't, I know another way of life. So as opposed to young people today who might be struggling, at in school, they don't, they've been relatively accepted, not completely accepted, but certainly more so than when I was in school. And now the political winds are shifting backwards, and they probably feel lost, I would imagine, right? Where I'm like, okay, I've been there, I know what that's about, I can do that, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, um,
So as far as you and I go, I'm heterosexual, and you weren't. We grew up in the same house, and just having that tension was never talked about. We didn't. Again, you didn't come out until I was gone, but I knew you were different than me, and you knew I was different than you, and that brought a lot of tension between us because I kept trying. I remember times where I kept trying to get you into my world. I kept trying to, get you into sports, and we do the Cheevers. Cheevers was the goalie for
yeah, yeah,
the Bruins back in the '70s, and I would
yeah,
make
yeah,
you be the goalie, or it was a stupid whatever we would. But we would just in our play, in our interaction, that heterosexual persona was coming out, and wanting you to get involved in all this stuff and be a sports guy, and you just weren't, and that
yeah.
was a tension between us.
Right, right. Um,
And I didn't understand it totally then. Part of it was our father was really into sports, um, and I didn't know if it was, I knew you guys had tension, so I didn't know if it was a rebellious thing against him. It was all that stuff was in the air, but nobody talked about it. So it was
right.
just this weird difference that we had with each other, that was there, that was palpable. It was palpable.
Yeah. It was like I said, it almost feels like a totally different world back then. And it was full of fear. It was full of being found out. It was, I'm like I said, I was a great chameleon. I was able to assimilate with a lot of those kids, and I was popular within that group, which made it even more treacherous, I guess. If I was able to just like fade back into the background, it would have been a lot easier for me. But I was kind of out there, and you know, so it was difficult. And I remember when Mom finally asked me if I was gay. I think I was about 15 years old, 15 or 16, which is pretty miraculous because I had that, even though with everything going on, I did have that sense of myself back then to answer her. So when she asked me, I answered in the affirmative. So I remember exactly what happened. She was taking me to get my hair cut at Auntie Mary's house, or Auntie Mary's salon in Holbrook. And she asked me, while we were on our way, and I said yes. So I went in to get my hair cut, and when I came out, she was gone. So she left me, probably 15 miles from home, with no explanation and nowhere to go. But it was an explanation. It was, it was her answer to,
Right.
you know, actually was my answer to her response.
Right.
She just left me, right?
Yeah.
So, and after that, that was a message. Like I didn't talk about it again, right, with her.
Wow.
Even
Yeah,
I,
that's a form of communication. She's communicating to you. She was disapproving of that by leaving,
right,
and without telling you, without saying, "Hey, I don't like this," and having a discussion and talking about it. She just up and left and communicated to you loud and clear that she was not approving
right,
of this decision.
yeah,
or this,
exactly.
and again, decision, lifestyle, or who your essence, who you are,
Right.
and and so to piggyback on that, or just to launch off that, I get involved in the church world, like the evangelical church. So we grew up Catholic. We really weren't Catholic. I mean, whatever we were, I don't know. We just went whatever. But I got involved when I was 19 in a evangelical church in the Assemblies of God, and the Assemblies of God pretty much at that time frame, and probably now, I don't even know. I'm not involved anymore, but they pretty dogmatic about homosexuality and calling it a sin and saying, it's not a lifestyle, it's a choice. And I was inundated with all of that. And at some point in this podcast today, I want to talk about my break from that. But before we do that, I want to talk about how, you knew I was getting involved in the church. I was definitely, dogmatic about it and telling not just about the homosexual stuff, but about, in fact, I didn't even think I even talked about that to you. I don't remember having those conversations, but you knew, I mean, you knew where I stood and, where my church stood, therefore I stood. So, what was that like for you, knowing that I got involved in the church? Now there was this moral authority behind me, supposedly, church authority behind me, with all this stuff. What was that like for you?
So I've got to be honest, Michael. I never really took your involvement in that in that church very seriously, and it did it was a further wedge in our already estranged relationship. So it I just really some of the preachings and I remember you had said to me we were on the phone one time, and you were probably in your early 20s. Our cousin had died that year or the year before, and so you had said that you had been waiting for these pamphlets from your church, some kind of, I don't know, scripture or books or whatever, and that you prayed about it, and they ended up in your mailbox the next day. And you were talking about that like it was some kind of miraculous thing. And I remember thinking to myself, and I may have even said to you, if God is worried about how quickly you get your mail and not about my cousin, then I don't want anything to do with him, right? So I remember that moment specifically. I don't know if I said that to you, but it's what I felt. It was sort of like, yeah, no, this isn't, I'm not getting this. So
Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember that. So it was just one more thing in our estrangement with one another back then. We and I like I said, I dropped out of school. Then I went to started hanging out in the city, and I had some friends, some gay friends back then. I kind of created this little pod of friends. But I remember there was this agency called Bridge Over Troubled Waters, and they helped teens like me get their GED. So I went to their classes for I don't know, a couple, 3 or 4 months, and studied to get my GED. And then at the end, they had a graduation for us at the State House. So it was pretty cool. So I kind of like, even though I didn't take that, the normal track, I found my own path. Right. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, and when I think back on that, I mean, I traveled from Weymouth every day, so that was a bus, and then hopping on the Red Line, I'm, 15, 16 years old, you know, knowing that I needed an education, knowing that, I couldn't just, just drop out of school, but it wasn't safe in school. It was not safe for me in school. So, right.
And I think that needs to be stated over and over. Like that's one of the reasons why, because you got tagged with loser, you quit school. So nobody knew that you had this tension where you knew you had to, if, for your own safety, you had to get out of Weymouth public schools.
Right.
Because if you found out that you were gay, the same thing that happened to that kid in the woods was going to happen to you probably. And so
Right.
you were like, no, I got to get out of here. But you got tagged with, even in our family, oh, you're a dropout, da da da. And
Right. Right.
then you went on and you were the first one in our family to get a degree. You got
Yeah. Right.
your
Right. Yeah.
your bachelor's degree.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean that must have been really hard for you keeping that secret, and you know,
Right, but I created my own peer group. I created, there's, kids my age, that I hung out with this family in Wollaston. There were two boys my age that were both gay, and and we did a lot of things that we shouldn't have. I mean, I was going to clubs when I was 15 years old. I had a fake ID, and so there was a lot of treacherous waters in that atmosphere as well. But it was safer than being in Weymouth Public Schools.
so for me and you, I think a tipping point or a turning point for our relationship, at least inside of me, was realizing that as I got more into the church and got more involved, I um I didn't like the rhetoric. I didn't like the hate that I was involved in. Just for context, for people who don't know me, I was in a mega church, and it was huge. And our youth group was probably the biggest in the country. Like at that time, there was over 1,000 kids coming, and I was the assistant youth pastor, and I was a pretty well known figure in the Assemblies of God youth ministry, and I was up and coming. And there was a lady that I worked with named Jeannie Mayo. I'll mention her name because we mentioned her name on my other podcast. But I was involved with her ministry, um, and it was a national ministry. I mean, everybody knew who it was. But as I got more involved in it and more involved in that world, the rhetoric on homosexuality was so hateful that I began inside of me going, I just don't like this. And there was an incident that happened. I was on a bus with a bunch of teenagers. We're on our way to Florida with a senior class trip for this Christian school I worked at. And there was a bunch of guys, the senior guys, I knew them all, good friends with them, had made it, basically invested, mentored a lot of them. There was a couple of them that I was not close to, super close to, but I knew them all. We're on our way down, and I was sitting in the middle of the bus, and in the back of the bus, about 6 or 7 of them were all hanging out, laughing, carrying on, having a good time. And one of them said, one of the guys that we weren't super close, he said, "Hey, I know what we can do when we get to Florida. Let's go gay bash and let's beat up some faggots." And I wasn't mad that he said that because he's an idiot, and that's the kind of thing that he says, and I knew him. But what really pissed me off was the 6 guys that I know didn't feel that way, didn't have the guts enough to challenge him. They just laughed. And I knew one of the kids that was in that circle, his dad had come out that year, and that's why that guy said it. So I was pissed, and I'm like, what am I going to do? So I got up and I walked back there, and they all respect me and they know me, and I walked back and I got into their faces and I said, "Hey, my brother lives in Florida. He's gay. Do you want his phone number? You can start with him. Beat him up first." And in my head, I was like, my brother David would mop those kids. But anyways, but bottom line is I made it personal. I made it personal to them. Like, hey, you just talked about my brother. Because that's what that church world doesn't take into consideration, is that it's somebody's brother. It's somebody's sister. It's somebody's life. Like you're just going to throw a term like that out, faggot, or, gay bash or whatever. Like you're just going to say that and not think of the ramifications of what you're actually talking about. You
Right.
don't see the hate that's in your heart when you're saying shit like that.
Right.
Like that bothered me. And one by one, those kids came back to me, not the kid that said it, but the other kids. And they said, "Hey, we're sorry about that." And like, well, don't apologize to me. Like challenge that kid. I'm not mad that he said it because he's an idiot, like I said, but I'm mad that you guys didn't challenge it,
Right. Right.
And I told that story in front, and when I was in Washington D.C., I was speaking at some conference, and I called you I told you about it. I remember
I think I
you and I
remember
talked
this.
on the
Yeah,
phone. Yeah,
yeah,
you and I talked on the phone, and we talked about that incident. And because I wanted you to know, Dave, I'm gonna start crying. I just wanted you to know that I value you as a person. Like you, that's what they don't do. They don't
right,
value, and that goes against my faith, my personal faith in God. He does value people as people, and but that church world that I was involved in was so just
right.
gross.
That instance. So there's a group mentality that that kind of coincides with that kind of hatred. So they may individually they may not all feel that way, but as a group. And the other part to this that people don't really look into that all that often is that sometimes the biggest homophobe is in the room is the biggest homo in the room, right? So there's a lot of
Yeah,
self-loathing that comes out of homophobia.
yeah.
So I always question that, like, okay, why are you so like this? The straightest guy in the world is really not going to care about me. It's the guy that questions somehow in some way his own masculinity, his own heterosexuality, is the one that's going to call me a faggot, right?
Wow.
So that's
Really?
the yeah, oh yeah, right, right,
Oh.
right.
So
Straight
like
guys
they,
don't, they straight guys are not intimidated by me, right? Real straight guys,
right.
the ones that are, the one who cries fag the loudest is probably the one
Struggle.
who's struggling the most.
He's closeted.
Sad, but that's what it is. So
Well, hey Dave, wrapping this up, it's been a good conversation. And if you're watching this and you're you're maybe you got some questions on this stuff and maybe you want to just drop it in the comment, how you feel about it. But David and I have mended our relationship by having conversations like this.
right,
And that's what my mom didn't do that day. She just took off and didn't have the conversation.
right.
That's offensive. That is communication. And
That's exactly how she dealt with everything, though, right?
yeah,
Mom, that's what she did. She cut and run. She just, so it was not out of character for her at all.
yeah,
So, I can understand. I mean, as a parent, you're thinking about grandkids, you're thinking about, all kinds of stuff. So I don't, I'm not saying that, it's an easy thing for any parent to face, but not facing it sent me a message like, okay, this is like you're not
it's shame.
worthy.
It's shame and guilt, and
Right,
and it was a way of saying to you, I don't approve of this,
right,
which brings a lot of shame. And that's what I like about our bantering back and forth throughout the years is, we've, not to get all into this, but I've looked at you and said, I'm sorry for the incidents that happened that were definitely offensive and not meaning to hurt you, but they did. You've apologized to me for things said, done, and we've had those conversations. And that's what you need to do in families, right? You need to
right.
have those conversations that are hard
You
and
don't leave them at the barber
own your
shop.
stuff. You got to
Right,
own it. I had to own the fact that I had some prejudice too. I mean, I grew up in Weymouth as well, and I
right,
understood the culture. I knew what it meant to be gay. We
right,
called people names and all that stuff. So there was a lot of ignorance on that subject, and I've grown through that. And even going to that church and being involved in that church, and then coming out of that and going, I got into some dogma there that wasn't really what right. So, but that's what life is about. It's about progressing, learning, growing, getting better, not hiding. I'm not going to hide the fact that I was homophobic when I was in the 70s because it was the culture. I'm not going to say I wasn't. I was. If you want to cancel me now, go ahead. I'm not trying to defend myself. I'm going to be honest about it.
right,
That mindset hurt my brother. It hurt my brother David. It hurt my brother David. So I'm going to grow and I'm going to learn. I'm going to get better because I don't want to hurt my brother David. You know what I mean? I don't want to hurt people. I want to be better. And I
right.
think that's the attitude you have to take, which means you got to look back and go, I probably screwed this up when I was younger and I did it wrong and I need to own that. And there's nothing wrong with that.
No, I mean, Michael, you didn't screw it. To say that it really wasn't wrong for your culture at the time. So, you can't really own it too much because, there was no independent thinking back then.
Right.
I mean, we were all part of this kind of like a mob thing,
Right.
so, and,
And that's what's going on today, and that's what you're worried about now with the current situation
right,
is that mob mentality. And again, I want to speak to people watching this who know me personally and know what world I'm in. Don't do that.
right,
Think for yourself.
right, right,
Make it personal. That's really what it comes down to,
right,
is make it personal, right? I mean,
right,
I don't want to get all biblical here, but the one my ear, like, just for an example, the mob was going after a woman because back in Jesus' day, and was going to stone her for having a sexual a relationship sexually with I mean, she was a prostitute, and they were going to stone her, but they saw her as a prostitute. They didn't see her as a person. They
right,
saw her as a prostitute. So the religious leaders took her out and saw her. They took a wide angle lens on her and said, she is a prostitute. Here's the list of things we don't like about that, and we're going to stone her. They were using it as a trap. But what he did is he looked at her as an individual and said, hey, look, she's a person. That's what I'm saying. That's where, if someone wants to define my faith now, that's what my faith is. It's about the person. It's not about the group,
right,
transgenders or homosexuals or whatever group you want to talk about. It's not about that. It's about the person.
right, right.
So,
Yeah,
anyways, not to get all into that. Maybe I should edit that out.
yeah. All right, Mikey, another good episode.
Davey D, I
All
love you, man.
right,
Love you, Dave.
episode 7. Whoop, love you too, Mike.
All right.
Ciao.
Peace out, kids. Hey, like us in the comments and all that stuff that you do on YouTube. All right.
Ciao
Bye.
for now. Bye.